Hello and welcome to the third session in our Power Tools for Coalitions webinar series. Today's topic is Advocacy and Lobbying, the Rules of the Road for Nonprofits. I am Kinkini Banerjee, the Coalitions Relations Manager at USBC, and this Power Tools series is part of our training, technical assistance, and capacity building support to the network of state, territorial, tribal, and community breastfeeding coalitions across the U.S. Our webinars are free and open to all interested breastfeeding advocates, coalition leaders and members, and anyone involved in forming or leading nonprofits in the breastfeeding field. The webinar announcements are sent through the USBC's announcement list. If you're not already on our list, you could go to www.usbreastfeeding.org/sign-up and join our mailing list. All sessions are recorded and archived. And we are delighted to have Anita Lischblau as our presenter today. Anita comes with a very illustrious and impressive career. Anita is a partner at the nonprofit organization of Gassner and Edwards, a Boston law firm which provides comprehensive legal advice to tax-exempt organizations and businesses and individuals involved in nonprofit matters. Her areas of legal expertise include nonprofit formation and affiliations, governance, fundraising, lobbying and political activity, employment, and government and foundation grants and contracts. Before joining Gassner and Edwards, Anita was general counsel for the Action for Boston Community Development, a large nonprofit human services organization and community action agency, and also the executive director of the Community Action Program Legal Services, a nonprofit providing legal training and technical assistance to approximately 1,000 community action agencies across the country. Prior to holding these positions, Anita was a senior trial attorney with the United States Department of Justice, handling white-collar criminal cases in federal courts in New England. Anita is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Cornell University. We are so pleased to have you do this vital training for our coalitions, Anita, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be able to talk to all the folks at the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee and all of your state association and individual members. This is such an important topic to talk about. I know that a lot of times the rules can be a little confusing to folks, so we'll try to clarify that, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So before we get into some of the nitty-gritty details, I want to step back for a minute and focus on really the key points that I'm hoping that you're able to take away from this presentation, even if you don't remember all of the details and all of the legal complexities of it. The key points are that 501c3 public charities may engage in any type of advocacy, education, or lobbying that furthers their charitable purpose. And I know that many of you are working for or representing 501c3 public charities. And most of you would be public charities. We'll go into private foundations in a moment, but I'm going to assume that most of you are working for or volunteering with public charities, 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. And so just again, those types of organizations may engage in lobbying. But, and here's the but part of it, they may engage in only a small amount of legislative lobbying, and that legislative lobbying must be reported to the IRS on Form 990, which is the annual return that needs to be filed by most tax-exempt 501c3 organizations. And you may also need to register with your state or the federal government as a lobbyist. And we'll go into a lot more detail on this, but again, I want to make sure you get the key points here in the very beginning. Another key point for many of you is that generally speaking, organizations may not pay for lobbying with government grant funds. And I know that many of you do get government grant funds. So again, 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, public charities may do lobbying, but only a little bit if it's legislative lobbying, and they need to register with the state or federal government, and Just be aware that generally speaking, you shouldn't be doing lobbying with government grant funds. You'll need to use other resources or volunteer time to do that. We'll get into more detail later. So a few more key points. The 501c3 rules, again, the tax-exempt public charity rules, I'm using those terms interchangeably, do not apply to government entities or their employees, but many states have their own rules limiting lobbying. I know that some of you listening to this may be state employees working on breastfeeding issues, so you may have different rules that apply to you, but many states do have their own rules limiting lobbying of their employees. Another key thing to remember is that even though the rules may limit or prohibit lobbying, sometimes if you're a state employee, on behalf of the employer or with government funds, you as individuals may lobby on your own time as private citizens. So, you know, most of what we're going to be talking about here is lobbying on behalf of your employers or organizations that you are connected with. But you can still always lobby as private citizens on your own behalf if you're not using the resources of your employer. So now let's talk about some of these terms. We hear these terms thrown around a lot, and sometimes people are a little mystified as to exactly what they mean. So advocacy, is it education, is it lobbying, what is it? Let's start with education. That is, typically speaking, providing unbiased information. It's providing both sides of an issue. It's providing facts. At least that's the ideal way of providing education. That's education. You're explaining to people about an issue. You're giving them facts as opposed to sort of one-sided propaganda. Okay, so that's education. That's the way the IRS looks at education. Now, if education also includes an attempt to influence, then it might also be advocacy, or it might be lobbying as well. Many times I will hear people say, when I talk about this topic to a lot of different groups over the years, I hear a lot of people say, we don't lobby, we educate. Well, maybe, but maybe not. In other words, just because you say you educate, that may be part of what you're doing, but you also may be advocating and you may be lobbying if you get involved in some of the other things we're going to talk about in a minute. So you can't kind of get around the lobbying rules or not call it lobbying just by saying it's education. It's possible it might just be education, but it's also quite possible that it's education plus, which means it's now turning it into advocacy or lobbying. So what do I mean by advocacy? Well, that's an attempt to influence the public or decision makers. So you're not just sort of presenting the facts, here's this side, here's that side, here's the facts. You're actually trying to get the readers or the listeners to agree with you on a certain position. And it might be, they might be decision makers, they might be members of the public, they might be members of your organization, but you're trying to influence them in some way in terms of what their views are on a particular issue. So that's advocacy. Now, if advocacy also includes an attempt to influence a specific government decision, then typically we think of that as lobbying as well. So, you know, we're sort of on a continuum here from education to advocacy to lobbying. And a lobbying is really a type of advocacy. But usually we're talking about a specific government decision that you want to be taken. The definition of lobbying, though, is very hard to give because it really depends on the specific rule involved. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, as I said before, generally lobbying is an attempt to influence specific government decisions or actions, but it might cover the executive branch. It usually covers the legislative branch, but it might also cover the executive branch. And it might cover local, state, and or federal levels of government. So again, it depends on the rule. Another thing to remember is that lobbying is distinct from political campaign activity. Different rules apply. A lot of times people think of sort of political activity rules. They kind of mush that together with lobbying, although they're certainly related. There are different rules that apply to those different types of activities. So lobbying is really trying to influence a decision by the existing government on some issue or some legislation or some regulation or some policy, as opposed to political campaign activity where you're really trying to get those particular decision makers elected, either to the legislature or to the executive branch. And those campaigning rules and political activity rules that, for example, apply to voter registration or things like that, those are different rules, and we're not going to cover those here, although they're certainly important to know about. Just to give you some examples of perhaps what might be education or advocacy or lobbying with respect to your particular issues, education might be explaining what the benefits of breastfeeding are. Maybe you're using statistics showing how likely children are to get certain infections or diseases or their health, breastfeeding versus not breastfeeding. Maybe you're talking about how much it costs or what percentage of the population or different populations breastfeed. That's all education. If that's what you're doing, not all, because obviously that's a lot, that's important, but if that's what you're doing, then that's education. But if you're then taking it to the next step and saying, well, the research shows that children and mothers benefit from breastfeeding, and therefore we really urge more mothers to breastfeed, and we think employers should make it easier for mothers to breastfeed, and so forth, well, that gets into advocacy. And then if you take it another step further and you say, well, we really think that the Congressional Appropriations Bill, for example, should continue to include money for the WIC peer counselors, or we would like Congress to pass the Breastfeeding Promotion Act, which will then extend some of the protections that are now given to non-exempt employees to exempt employees. That turns into lobbying. And so those are a few examples, and we'll go into a little more detail in terms of what the rules are and why that's so. So here are some of the examples of the types of federal lobbying rules that apply. There are the tax rules, so that's the tax code, and the IRS regulations that go along with it. There are appropriations acts. So whenever, at least on the federal level, when money is spent on a program, that is not just up to the agency that spends the program. Congress is responsible for appropriating funds for particular programs and particular purposes. And in those very, very, very long annual appropriations acts, they often cover multiple agencies, and they will often have provisions in there that say not just how much money a particular program like WIC is going to get, but will also have rules about how that money can and cannot be spent. And so part of that we'll see is Appropriations Act as to whether funds can be spent for lobbying. Grant and contract rules. Many of you have grants from the state or from the feds or from other organizations to provide certain services and to carry out certain activities. You may also have contracts. And in those grants and contracts, there will sometimes be rules about how you can spend the money, for what purposes you cannot spend the money. And typically, for grants at least, those grants will be authorized by particular program regulations. So like WIC program regulations and that sort of thing. So you need to make sure you're familiar with the contract provisions and any incorporated rules for that, which again may address, for example, what you can and cannot spend the grant money on, which may include lobbying. There are also criminal provisions, or there's a criminal provision applicable to lobbying with federally appropriated funds. And there are also laws that relate to registration as a lobbyist and disclosure and reporting by registered lobbyists. So let's turn to what the tax rules are. So this is what the Internal Revenue Code says about what 501c3 public charities may and may not do in connection with lobbying. And again, just to clarify, what we mean by 501c3 public charities are, we're talking about 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, and those are organizations that are both exempt from paying tax on their related income, the income that's related to their exempt purposes, and donors to those organizations can take a deduction on their income tax for purposes of paying their income tax. So Public charities are a form of these 501c3 organizations, which are divided into two categories. One is public charities, one is private foundations. I'm assuming that all of you are going to be public charities, but just so you understand the terminology there. All right, get off that issue, and let's talk about what does the Internal Revenue Code say about what 501c3s can do in connection with lobbying. And what it says is that 501c3s may do a little but not a lot of lobbying. It doesn't use that language exactly, but that's my interpretation of it in layperson's language. What it actually says is that lobbying may not be a substantial part of the total activities of the 501c3 organization. We'll talk in a few minutes about what that means, but just to get out the basic framework here. The IRS rules don't actually use the term lobbying. Instead, they use the terms carrying on of propaganda and attempting to influence legislation. But I think the way most of us would interpret that, it is what we think of as lobbying. Now, what's very important to know is that it does not apply to all types of lobbying. It applies to sort of a subset of lobbying. It applies to lobbying with respect to local, state, and federal legislation. Okay, so legislation only. Remember before I said that some lobbying rules apply to actions taken by executive agencies. For example, the USDA. It might be lobbying in connection with regulations that the USDA promulgates or policies or things like that. That may be true for other rules, but for purposes of the Internal Revenue Code and its application to 501c3s, they're only concerned with legislation. So that's what we're talking about here. All right, it also defines this lobbying, as I'll call it, as attempts to influence the adoption, rejection, or content of legislation. So that's fairly broad, and it includes not just the legislation once it's filed in the legislature, but you also may be working on a proposal to draft legislation. Now, at some point, and this is kind of a gray area, it turns from a fairly general, vague idea, maybe we should do something to require or to incentivize employers, let's say, to make it easier for women to breastfeed in the workplace. That's kind of your general policy idea. That's not going to be lobbying for purposes of the IRS. But at some point it turns into more specific legislation. You start drafting it, you start thinking about what that actually looks like. So when it turns into a specific proposal in sort of legislative language, then at that point it becomes legislation. But this is a bit of a gray area. It also includes ballot initiatives, ballot referenda, and also includes appropriations bills. Now, it's important to note that for 501c3 public charities, there are two tests for whether the organization has engaged in too much lobbying. The first test we call the substantial part test, and the second test is the Section 501H quantitative test, and we often call that the Section 501H test. The substantial part test is the default test. In other words, most likely you are probably all subject to the substantial part test unless you have affirmatively elected to be subject to the 501H test. And we'll talk in a minute about how you do that, but my guess is that maybe some of your state associations have elected to be subject to 501H, but my guess is that most of the local organizations probably have not, although some of you may. The substantial part test is based on what the IRS calls all the facts and circumstances. So they look at everything across the board. It's pretty vague. It focuses on activities of your organization, not just expenditures. So you can't just sort of say, okay, our budget is $1 million, let's just keep it to under 5%. As long as we do that, we're fine. That's not necessarily going to keep you safe from going over the threshold of not an insubstantial part. So what do they look at? Well, the IRS will look at things like your total activity, which might include volunteers. If you have a lot of volunteers, if they're doing a lot of your work, they're going to look at how much volunteer time is being spent on your behalf on lobbying. They also might look at your website. So if your website, let's say, has, I don't know, 20 pages, and if 10 of them are talking about some proposed legislation, then they might think that's a substantial part. Or they might look at your newsletter or the publicity that you send out. And it, even though perhaps as a percentage of your total budget, you're not spending that much to put that content on the website, maybe you're getting it from somebody else, and so it really costs very little. The IRS still might say, well, we're not looking just at the percentage of your expenditures. We're looking at your total activity in a very broad way. On the other hand, the Section 501H quantitative test does look at the dollars that you actually spend as a percentage of your total expenditures. So the substantiality is based on dollar thresholds, which I'll explain in a minute. Another thing about the 501H, which is often a benefit over the substantial part test, is that there are more specific rules and definitions as to what lobbying is. And there are also broader exceptions, things that you might otherwise think would be lobbying. They have actually accepted from or exempted from the definition of lobbying. So what is the lobbying definition under the substantial part test? And again, remember, that's the first test. That's the default test that my guess is most of you are going to be subject to. Well, they have to find it to some extent, and it's the following: contacting or urging the public to contact members of a legislative body for purpose of proposing, supporting, or opposing legislation. Okay, so that's sort of typically what we think of in terms of lobbying. So that could be emails, calls, meetings, that sort of thing, with members of the legislative body, but also it probably includes staff people. Or it includes advocating the adoption or rejection of legislation. So that's a bit broader. If you think about this, you might put stuff on your website that would be advocating adoption or rejection of legislation. You might have letters to the editor in your newspaper. You might have press releases, all that sort of thing, where you're not actually having any direct contact with anyone in the legislature, nor are you even asking other people to contact legislators, but you are still in some form or other advocating the adoption or rejection of legislation. So it does not include just a passive response to legislative committee's invitation to testify at a hearing. So, for example, there may be a notice, public notice that is put up, we want people to come testify, or perhaps a specific invitation to come testify. That, the IRS says, you do not have to count as lobbying. It also does not include nonpartisan analysis, study, and research if the organization doesn't participate in drafting of or advocating for the adoption of any legislation. So again, we go back to that sort of education piece of it. If you've got a white paper out that sort of explains what the research is on the benefits of breastfeeding and sort of how it works and what works best in terms of encouraging women to breastfeed and that sort of thing, and doesn't then go on to promote a particular piece of legislation, and you don't then participate in drafting of or advocating for the adoption of any legislation. In other words, it's not sort of written really for the purpose of the legislation, then that's probably okay and not considered lobbying. Okay, so now if you do the 501H test, either for those of you who already have done it and have elected to do so by filling out the form with the IRS and filing it with the IRS, or you're thinking about doing it, here's the test for that. They have a sort of a sliding scale here, up to a maximum annual lobbying expenditure of $1 million. My guess is that none of you are thinking of or spending anywhere near $1 million, but for some larger organizations like hospitals or large universities, they might be spending that much money. So it's the 20% of the first $500,000 of your exempt purpose expenditures, which is basically, I would say, just think of it as all your expenditures, plus 15% of the next $500,000, plus 10% of the next $500,000, plus 5% of the remaining exempt purpose expenditures. So you kind of need to add that up. You know, if you're a small organization, you've only got $500,000 in expenditures for the year, then it's just 20%, and you go from there. There's also a separate 25% grassroots lobbying cap. So, you know, you have to think of it, again, if you're, let's say your total expenditures are $1 million, then in addition to this sliding scale, it's also a separate, of that amount, only 25% of your total expenditures can be grassroots lobbying. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so remember I said before that under the 501H section, the IRS has actually added a number of more detailed definitions of what is lobbying, what isn't lobbying, and what's direct lobbying, and what's grassroots lobbying. So we'll go through those here. Direct lobbying is defined as an attempt to influence legislation through any communication with the legislator or the staff. That, I think you would probably assume that to be the case. Communication with an executive branch officials who participate in the formulation of legislation if the principal purpose is to influence legislation. So maybe you're going to talk to your governor, hoping that your governor will take a stand on maybe some state legislation. Attempt to influence the public on a ballot initiative. I don't know if there are any ballot initiatives on these issues, but if there were, that would the public is sort of considered like the legislature is for purposes of legislation, because a ballot initiative is really a form of legislation. Communication by the organization encouraging its members to make direct lobbying communication. So the idea here is that the IRS says that if you have members, if your organization has members, and you're saying to your members, call your local representative and ask them to vote in favor of this legislation, then that will be considered direct lobbying. And because of the additional grassroots lobbying cap, it is better to be considered direct lobbying than grassroots lobbying. Okay, I have now lost the connection. Hold on one second. Okay, back on again.
Terrific.
All right. I assume you can slice this, right?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So direct lobbying only counts. It counts as direct lobbying only if the communication refers to specific legislation or initiative and reflects a view on the legislation. So that's important to know for what counts as lobbying for the IRS and what doesn't. Again, it has to refer to a specific legislation or a ballot initiative, and it has to reflect a view on the legislation. So just because you mention legislation, if you don't sort of reflect a view on it to oppose it or support it, it will not be considered direct lobbying. It doesn't have to use express language like that, but if it's clear from the communication that you are opposing it or supporting it, then it probably will be considered direct lobbying. On the other hand, grassroots lobbying means an attempt to influence legislation through affecting the opinions of the general public. So this means you're trying to get members of the public to do your lobbying for you, in essence. And there's a three-part test as to whether it's considered grassroots lobbying. It refers to specific legislation, it reflects a view on the legislation, and there is what we call a call to action, and that means you are asking members of the public to do something about it, to call their representatives, email them, and so forth. Okay, so there are also some exceptions from the lobbying definition. And these are important, and they only apply to 501c3 organizations that have elected under the 501h expenditure test. So if you're not electing, and again, I'm assuming most of you are not, these will be interesting, especially if you decide you want to do the 501h election, but you should not assume that these will apply to you if you just use a substantial part test and do not go with the election. In fact, the IRS has said that these only apply to organizations that have elected under 501h. Now, some of them are sort of similar to the one to the substantial part. For example, the first one, preparing and making available results of the nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. But for this one, it says even if it reflects a position, whereas if you don't elect, I think if it reflects a position, it's probably going to be considered lobbying. So this is just one example of why sometimes it's better to do the 501h because you can get in more activity that won't count as lobbying. Providing technical advice at the written request of a governmental body. So you can imagine, let's say, a congressional committee or state legislative committee saying, you know, we really want to know what the numbers show about breastfeeding, or you have a grant to do such and such. Can you tell us what's going on with this, or would this type of legislation make an impact, that type of thing. That would be technical advice, and it would have to be at the written request of a governmental body to be accepted from the lobbying definition. Self-defense communication, so my guess is this is not going to apply to you, but let's say there was a law that, or a rule that would prohibit certain types of 501c3 organizations from getting WIC money, that type of thing, self-defense, or would say that you're no longer going to be entitled to a tax exemption, or something that really goes to the core of whether you are able to continue operating as a nonprofit corporation. It's not just that, well, the amount of money we're going to get from a particular grant is really going to hurt us. You can't, that's not good enough to say it's a self-defense communication. Member communications on legislation of direct interest to the organization is no direct encouragement to lobby. So let's say that, again, you have something in your newsletter or an email that just says, well, here's an interesting bill that's come up in our state legislature, and we think this is good, but you don't then go on to say, and please call your representative. So that would be an exception from lobbying definition. Again, if you've done the 501h expenditure, you would not have to count that as lobbying. And discussion of broad social, economic, and similar issues would also not be considered lobbying, although that probably wouldn't be considered lobbying under either test. So what happens if you violate these rules? Well, if you are going under the substantial part test, as most of you probably are, there is a possibility that your tax-exempt status would be revoked. That doesn't happen terribly often, but certainly that is a possibility that that could be done if you do too much lobbying. There is also a 5% excise tax on the organization and its manager if you exceed that substantial part. So that would mean that the individual managers, like the executive director, for example, and board members and so forth, may have to pay a tax on the amount of lobbying expenditures that you have done sort of in excess of that substantial part threshold, or cap, I should say. The Section 501h expenditure test has somewhat different penalties. There is a 25% tax on lobbying expenditures that exceed the cap, but you only are faced with potential revocation of your tax-exempt status if your annual lobbying expenditures on average over a 4-year period exceed 150% of either the grassroots lobbying or the general lobbying cap. So you can spread it out over 4 years. If your lobbying in 1 year is particularly high and goes over those tiered limits that we looked at, you have another few years to see if it kind of smooths out. If your C3 status is revoked, you would not be eligible for applying for a C4 classification. C4 classification are what we call social welfare organizations, and those are allowed to do unlimited lobbying. But you can't sort of say, well, I'll sort of hedge my bets and, we'll see whether they catch me on the C3. If not, well, so they'll revoke it. I'll just take the C4. The IRS is not going to let you do that. Private foundations, again, I'm assuming that none of you are private foundations, but just so that you're sort of aware of the potential implications on your organization. Private foundations are heavily taxed on most legislative lobbying, so in essence, they really can't do it. There's self-defense lobbying, which we talked about, that they can do. But why it might be important to you is that I'm assuming that some of you may get grants from private foundations, and you will often see language in there about not using any of the grant funds to do lobbying. And basically the rule is that grants from private foundations may not be earmarked for lobbying. So if you're writing grant proposals, I would recommend that you not include lobbying in there as at least part of the funds that you are asking for. If it's, let's say you're asking for funding as part of a larger project and maybe you're using unrestricted funds, your organization's own unrestricted donated funds to do lobbying, that will be okay, but you need to be able to show that you have enough other funds to do the lobbying and that you're not using the grant funds to do so. Okay, now I know that some of you may be state associations, so perhaps some of you are 501c4s or maybe 501c6s. And as I said before, those types of organizations may engage in unlimited amount of legislative or other types of lobbying. They don't have the same restrictions as 501c3s, so long as the legislation furthers or relates to your organization's exempt purposes. One thing you should be aware of is that the portion of dues that are paying for lobbying and political activity is not deductible by members as a business expense. And typically an organization, a C4, will either notify members annually of the non-deductible portion of your dues, or the organization will pay what we call a proxy tax on these amounts to the IRS. But typically, if the members are 501c4s, they're not paying the same tax. They don't have the same types of business expenses and so forth, so that may not apply in your situation. Okay, now I said before that a key point was that you need to keep track of and report to the IRS on what lobbying you are doing. And that's what we're getting to here. That reporting would be done on Form 990, assuming that you are doing a Form 990. There's also a Form 990 EZ for smaller organizations. But the Schedule C would be required on the Form 990, and that's where it asks about various lobbying expenditures. So if you, again, if you are a non-501H electing C3, you have to report lobbying expenditures. You also have to describe the lobbying activity. However, if you're a 501H, you only have to report the money, the expenditures. You don't have to describe what you're doing. You need to, in either case, establish a system to track the information and to train your staff so they understand what needs to be tracked. I would recommend that for staff, you either use timesheets or other time records. And I know that for many organizations, they do not use time cards or time records for their exempt staff. But if that's the case, then you need to think of some other system, some other, whether it's a form or whether it's just an informal email to the CFO. But you need to keep some record of how much time even your exempt employees and certainly your non-exempt employees are spending on lobbying. It doesn't have to be to the minute, but some general idea whether you spent an hour here, an hour there, to keep track of it on a regular basis. I would suggest that it be reviewed perhaps on a quarterly basis by the CFO or someone who understands the lobbying rules to make sure that you don't exceed the IRS cap on lobbying. And again, I know some of you may be looking for that nice percentage. But all I can say is that if you're looking for the percentage, if you want that level of specificity and that certainty, then you'll need to do the 501H election. Otherwise, you'll have to live with a little uncertainty. My guess is that most of you are not doing that much lobbying, so you know, if it's a fairly small amount, we're talking about, you know, maybe 10, 15 hours, 20 hours, a quarter. It really depends on the size of your organization as to whether that's a lot of activity. But that's something you're going to have to keep track of and review on a regular basis. Don't forget to include the allocable compensation as well as other related costs like overhead, space costs, you know, some small portion of if you're using your website and computer and internet and that kind of stuff. So you need to include all those related costs that go into doing the lobbying. Don't forget to include the time and resources spent in preparation for the lobbying. So it's not just the 1 hour you spend with your state legislator. It's also the probably many hours that were spent in preparation for that meeting, whether they're fact sheets or sort of preparation sessions. So you need to think about the preparation for the lobbying as well. If you're using the facts and circumstances test, as most of you probably are, don't forget you need to include not just activity that you might spend money on, like staff time, but also volunteers. So you need to make sure that if you've got a nice group of volunteers or volunteer board members that are helping you out with the lobbying, you need to have some way for them to also report on, you know, how many hours are they spending doing the volunteering. With the volunteering, it's not quite as important that you track the number of hours really closely, but you are going to have to describe it. I often suggest that the best way to understand what you really need to track is to actually look on Schedule C of the Form 990. Then you'll get a really clear sense of, okay, now I understand I'm going to have to answer yes or no to this, because there's kind of a list of different types of lobbying activities, and then you're going to have to describe some of them, and you're going to have to put a monetary value on them as well. So I think that's an excellent way to get a better understanding of how you're going to track the lobbying activities and what you actually need to track. Some of you may be in organizations that have either set up an affiliated 501c4 to conduct lobbying, or at the state association level or the local level, and that's certainly something that many C3s have done. They want to do a fair amount of lobbying. They're afraid it's going to exceed the cap that C3s are allowed, so they set up 501c4s to carry out more extensive lobbying, or also to engage in political campaign activity, which is something that they can do, although it can't be their primary activity. If you do that, or you're involved with a situation where there's two affiliated organizations, you do have to make sure that you keep the organizations separate. They can certainly share staff and resources, that's pretty common, but make sure there's some sort of written agreement that allocates the expenses in proportion to the benefit received. So again, you probably want to have these people doing some sort of time cards or some sort of written record of, okay, I spent 20% of my time this week on this organization and 80% on the other organization. So you need to keep track of that. There should also be separate boards of directors, separate bank accounts, separate financial records for the two different organizations. I know that many of you are receiving federal or perhaps state grants and contracts. We're going to talk here about federal grants and contracts. Generally speaking, you may not use federal grants or contract funds for state or federal legislative lobbying. There are annual federal appropriations acts that I mentioned earlier. The coverage differs depending on exactly which federal agency you're talking about, but there is very broad coverage for HHS, education, and labor. It includes not only legislation, but it also includes lobbying on policy issues and regulations, administrative actions, and so forth. So it's quite broad. You should also be aware of the federal cost principles. It is now codified at 2 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 230 for nonprofit grantees, and there is a specific section there on lobbying in Appendix B, Paragraph 25. That 2 CFR section is also known as OMB Circular A122, and that applies to grant-funded employee time, expenses, and travel, and so forth. There are some exceptions, but they're limited, and they're often hard to kind of really shoehorn yourself into. We'll talk about those in a minute. I just want to go back to the previous slide for 1 second and mention that some of you may have heard that there are some changes in the OMB circulars. There is something that is sometimes called an OMB super circular, OMB omnibus circular, OMB guidance on grants, administrative grants and costs and so forth. Different names for it. That came out the end of last year, and that is supposed to be implemented by the federal agencies via regulations by the end of this year, although I'm not sure that's actually going to happen since I haven't seen anything yet, but it might. And when that does happen, as you get new grants, those new regulations will be incorporated. In terms of the lobbying cost principles, there are some changes which I'll talk about, but they're not terribly major. All right, so the current exceptions, and these will be continued in the new super circular for lobbying, include technical and factual presentations through hearing testimony, statements, or letters. It's similar to the exception for organizations electing under 501H for the tax code. Not exactly the same, though. And that would be, again, these are only through hearing testimony, statements, or letters, so not just your average meeting, let's say, with a legislator or staff. It has to be in response to a documented request, and travel, lodging, and meal costs are not allowable unless it's to offer testimony at a congressional hearing pursuant to a written request made by the chairman or the ranking minority member of a committee or subcommittee. So that probably doesn't happen all too often. So for the most part, you should assume probably that most of the travel, lodging, and meal costs will not be allowable, and that the ability to use federal grant funds to make these presentations is fairly limited, although it certainly could be done. Self-defense lobbying, which you talked about before in connection with the IRS, is also another exception, so you could use federal grant funds to do that. Now, when I say could use, let me just step back a second and clarify. What I really mean is that it's not prohibited to use those funds for that purpose, because of course, like any cost that is charged to federal grant money, it still has to comply with all the other many requirements, that it be reasonable, that it further the purpose of the grant, that it be documented, and so forth. So what I really mean here is that it wouldn't be prohibited to use those grant funds for that purpose if it comes within one of these exceptions. So self-defense, again, would be if there's some sort of legislation out there that would prohibit your organization from really engaging in the type of activities that you would otherwise do as part of your mission. Here are some more A122 exceptions. If a statute expressly permits a certain type of lobbying to be carried out with grant or contract funds, to be honest, I haven't really seen, I'm not sure I've seen any statutes that do that, so I wouldn't count on that one. And we talked about already here the super circular. It does add one thing there that I do want to mention. The super circular adds a ban on the use of federal grant funds for membership fees for organizations whose primary purpose is lobbying. And the other thing it does is incorporate the exceptions to the Internal Revenue Code limitation on lobbying to the limitations on using federal grant funds. So basically, what it does is it takes those exceptions that I said are only applicable to organizations that elect under 501H, and the definitions that are only applicable to organizations that elect under 501H. It takes all those and says, okay, we're going to incorporate this into the rules that govern when you can use federal grant money to do lobbying. So you could be in a situation where you haven't actually elected, but you could still use those rules, I suppose, to say, well, okay, it still counts as lobbying for purposes of the IRS, but I can use this federal grant money to engage in this type of lobbying. I still have to count it as lobbying in terms of whether I'm going over the substantial part threshold, but I can use federal grant funds to do it. A little complicated, but that's the idea. Now, if you are a state or local government grantee, A122 does not apply to you. Instead, A87 applies to you, which is codified at 2 CFR Part 225. and that's in Appendix B, paragraphs 24 and 25. For some reason, not quite sure why, the only provision in A87 that relates to lobbying is, legislative lobbying rather, is the ban on membership dues in organizations substantially engaged in lobbying. So the super circular will almost incorporate that language, although it's a little bit different. Still, though, most provisions that relate to 501c3s with respect to legislative lobbying will not apply to government grantees, except for this language, which is very similar to the current language, but a little bit different. Instead of saying organizations that substantially are engaged in lobbying, it says organizations whose primary purpose is lobbying. And those membership fees would not be allowable as a federal grant cost. Okay, if you are a C4 or you're involved with a C4 organization and you lobby, you may not receive federal grant funds. If the recipients of federal funds lobby, you should carefully track those expenditures to establish the use of non-federal resources. So then you would be a C3, because as I said, if you're a C4 that lobbies, you can't receive federal grant funds. And also you should be aware that you may not include the time or the resources spent on lobbying as a direct or an indirect cost charged to federal funds. So you can't just kind of throw it in your indirect cost pool if you have an indirect cost pool and not worry about it. It's lobbying, it's lobbying, it's lobbying. It doesn't matter whether it's direct or indirect cost. What is known as the Byrd Amendment, after the senator from West Virginia, I believe, it says that federal funds may not be used to lobby federal executive branch or Congress to influence the awarding, modification, or extension of specific grant, contract, or loans, including earmarks. So we're not talking about a whole huge program like the WIC program. We're talking about specific grants, contracts, or loans that you might be trying to get from the federal government, and those would include earmarks, although these days there aren't as many earmarks as there used to be. So you cannot use federal funds to do that. However, you can use non-federal funds, and if you do so, you must report that on a form that usually comes with the assurances you are asked to sign when you are applying for or receiving federal grants. What about state grants or contract funds? Some of you may have those. They're not federal grants, they're just state grants. They also may prohibit the use of their funds for lobbying, or at least some types of lobbying. So you need to check the contract language. You need to check the applicable regulations. If it's a pass-through of federal funds, then it also may incorporate the same federal fund rules that we've been talking about. Again, going back to state and local government employees, you should check your state law and your employer's policies about lobbying. If necessary, talk to the attorney for your state agency to see what you can and can't do. Some states do prohibit employees from legislative lobbying, at least on government time. And even if state law does not prohibit that generally, federal and state law restrictions applicable to the use of state or federal grant funds by the state or the local government's grantees would still apply. Don't forget that all these rules do not preclude you from lobbying as a private citizen on your own time. The other issue that we briefly mentioned at the beginning was lobbying registration. So you need to think about the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act and the State Lobbying Registration Rules. The state lobbying registration rules really differ by state, so that's something I can't really tell you in this presentation, but often if you look on your state, different state agencies, whichever the state agency is that regulates lobbying, it might be the Secretary of State's office, it might be another office, it might be the ethics agency. We'll usually have something up on their website that kind of explains what the rules are. It may require registration on an annual basis. It may require reporting every 6 months, every quarter, something like that. Many of the state laws do have exceptions for small amounts of lobbying. So you may just come within that and not have to lobby. You might not have to register at all. So let's talk about the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act. Again, this may not apply to any of you, but in case you do a fair amount of federal lobbying, here's kind of a quick and dirty explanation of what it is. Paid lobbyists and organizations that employ lobbyists must register and report. This applies to paid employees who lobby, not volunteers. Now, who's a lobbyist? Who's considered a lobbyist under this federal rule? A lobbyist is an individual who has more than one lobbying contact and spends more than 20% of his or her time on lobbying activities in a 3-month period. Now, your organization is exempted from these requirements if the total lobbying expenses do not or aren't expected to exceed about $12,500. I believe that number is adjusted on some regular basis in a 3-month period. So, you know, if you don't spend that much, then you don't need to worry about it. But if you are spending at least $12,500 in a 3-month period, or you know, on average you are, then you should start thinking about whether anybody in your organization is a lobbyist and whether you need to register. That includes influencing covered executive branch officials and Congress. So it's not just legislative lobbying. And it also includes preparation for lobbying contacts. If the lobbyist or organization is required to register, then he or she and the organization must make quarterly reports on lobbying activities and expenditures and semi-annual reports on political contributions and gift rule compliance. So, how do you lobby within the rules? Let's sort of take a step back here. We've heard a lot of sort of complex rules here, and your head may be spinning a bit. So let's just step back and think about, again, what are the important things you need to remember, because really the purpose of this session is not to discourage you from lobbying, rather it's to encourage you to lobby, and to do that by trying to clarify what the rules are and you're understanding what you can and can't do. So with that in mind, let's take a big picture look at how to lobby within the rules. So an important thing is don't use government funds for lobbying by staff or outside consultants or groups. Now, you know, we talked about a number of different exceptions, and you can certainly try to shoehorn yourself into those. I find that by trying to do that, organizations are sort of tying their hands behind their backs and really limiting their capacity to do effective lobbying. So I think the best way to do it is to either have some unrestricted funds and use those to lobby, or else if people are willing to lobby on their own time, sometimes organizations, CEOs, or other people at the upper level will say, I'm going to the state legislature, the state capitol rather, to lobby. I'm going to take the day off, use my vacation time to do that. So that's certainly a way that many organizations will do it if they don't have unrestricted funds or they don't want to use their valuable unrestricted funds for that purpose. Be careful about doing that, though, with non-exempt employees. Really should not do that, because by either allowing them to do what is really work or requiring them, even worse, to do the lobbying, that really has to be considered work time, and you have to pay them, and once you pay them, obviously you've just created that issue once again. So again, don't use government funds, use either unrestricted funds, use volunteers, use board members, for example, to leverage the time spent by paid staff in preparing materials for lobbying. Use volunteers, other board members, and also consider whether some of your exempt staff may be willing to do this lobbying on their paid vacation time. It can be paid, by the way. It's okay if it's paid vacation time, but it should be clearly recorded somewhere, whether time cards or some sort of memo or something, that this is time that they are taking as vacation time rather than work time. Adopt a lobbying policy so that people are clear on what the rules are and what is allowed. For example, does someone have to okay time spent on lobbying? How are you going to report lobbying time? Who is going to be reviewing how much lobbying time is spent so that you don't exceed the threshold and so that you have the information necessary for the 990 and so forth? Educate the board and your staff on lobbying rules. It's good to have a policy, but if the policy isn't really something that people are trained on, my guess is just going to be a piece of paper, and it's not going to be terribly useful. Consider the Section 501H election. If you like certainty, that's certainly an easier way to do it. So that's one thing to do. You can do that just by getting the form on the IRS website. I believe the form number is 8978, I believe, but I'm sure if you just Google 501H election IRS, you will get there. Staff and board members, as I said, need to track their legislative lobbying for Form 990 purposes, and also for purposes of federal grant expenditures. So you need to have some way to carve out that time from the expenditures of federal grant money. So one thing that you may want to think about doing is, for example, for your CEO, other people that are going to engage in lobbying, I would recommend that their time never be paid 100% with federal grant funds. There should always be some percentage of their time that is spent that is paid by unrestricted funds, because they're going to be doing things that are not reimbursable under the cost principles, which would include lobbying and which would include, for example, fundraising. And there are other things that are perfectly okay to do and are probably something CEOs and should be doing, or development people or whoever, but it may not be reimbursable. And so I recommend that at least some portion of those people's time be paid with non-federal funds. So now we're going to just talk about a few examples before the Q&A. And here's one example, and I'll just kind of talk through it. Unfortunately, you're not on the other side here, so I can't hear your input, which I would like to, but I'll just kind of talk my way through some of these examples. Joanne, who's an employee of a 501c3 organization, goes on a tour with her local state representative of some local hospitals and health centers that provide breastfeeding support for new mothers. There's no discussion of any proposed legislation or government funding of any breastfeeding program. She's just going on a tour and showing them what the hospitals are doing and how they support new mothers. Now, that really should not be a problem with respect to any of the lobbying rules. There's no lobbying there. It's really educating people about it. Even though it's your local state representative, it's educating him or her about the programs, about the issues, and that would not be considered lobbying. So you would not need to report that to the IRS or worry about whether it is prohibited as a grant cost. Now, if you do want to charge it to a grant, of course, it still has to meet all the other requirements and has to somehow be part of the grant purposes. Number two, the State Breastfeeding Coalition, which I will call SBC, is a 501c3 that receives no government funding, posts on its website a request to readers to contact their representatives in Congress to urge them to vote in favor of the Breastfeeding Promotion Act. All right, is that lobbying? And if so, what do you need to do about it? I think that is a pretty clear example of lobbying. There's a call to action there. You're putting that on your website, and you're asking people to lobby. It's really grassroots lobbying. And so you would need to, let's say you do not elect under 501H, you would need to include this on Schedule C, rather, of your 990, and you'd want to sort of keep track of what you're doing, and so you can describe it, and you'd also need to put some value on how much it costs to do this. So you're going to have to allocate some website costs, allocate some time in terms of personnel that wrote this post and so forth. So that's what you're going to have to do. That would be considered lobbying if you're using federal grant funds. If you have federal grant, well, in this case, I'm sorry, you do not have any government funding here, so that would not be an issue. Now, let's say it's the same as the above, but the request is sent by email only to members of SBC. Okay, well, if you are not electing under 501H, that's still going to be considered lobbying, so you need to count it as lobbying and include it in your 990. If you do elect under 501H, then that would be considered lobbying, but direct lobbying, not grassroots lobbying. So because it's members, you are just directing it to members, not putting it up on your website. Now, let's go to the next alternative here. Same thing, number 2, but request is sent only to the members, and you don't ask them, the members, to contact congressional representatives. In other words, there's no call to action to the members. That actually, if you elect it under 501H, would not even be considered lobbying. Okay, let's go on to the next example, number 3. Sarah is an employee of a 501c3 organization that is a member of SBC and does not receive government grant funds. She meets with her congresswoman in D.C. to talk about the need for increased funding for WIC peer counseling. So let's see, what does that mean? Is that a problem? Is that lobbying? Well, it certainly seems like lobbying. We're talking about appropriations. There's probably an appropriations bill that's at issue, and she is lobbying for more money for an increase in appropriations from Congress. So that would certainly be considered lobbying and should be included in the amount when you're sort of monitoring how much lobbying you're doing. Now, what about Gene? He's an employee of another 501c3 that is a member of SBC but does receive federal grant funding. He also attends the meeting. Well, his organization is also going to have to report that as lobbying and just consider that in terms of whether it's exceeded the threshold. But he's got another issue because his organization receives federal grant funding, and if he is actually paid with that federal grant funding, then that could be an issue. Can't charge that time to the federal grant. So either he's going to have to attend that meeting on his personal time, in other words, not charge this time worked, but as vacation, or just not included as the hours worked, or they're going to have to find some unrestricted funding. So again, depending on sort of how his compensation is paid, if he is doing this thing on a regular basis, then again, I recommend that perhaps not all of his compensation be paid with federal funds and that some be paid with unrestricted. Prior to the meeting, Judy, who works for Gene, prepares a report summarizing the health and economic benefits of breastfeeding for Gene and Sarah to use at the meeting. Well, even though she's not going to the meeting, she is helping them prepare for it. She's preparing the report. So, and that's going to be used at the meeting with the congresswoman. So that should be considered lobbying for IRS purposes. Also, by the way, we didn't talk about this here, but you also have to consider whether any of these people need to register as a lobbyist under the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act. Does the organization receive more than or spend more than $12,500 on average each quarter on lobbying? Do any of these people spend more than 20% of their time on lobbying and so forth? So for Judy's purposes, though, again, her organization does get federal funding. You need to make sure that her time is not being charged to federal funds. And lastly, the fourth example is that Gene has asked his volunteer board members to email their congressional representatives urging them to vote for a bill in the state legislature that would require paid breastfeeding breaks. So this introduces the issue of volunteer board members. Well, so for purposes of the IRS, let's say that this C3 has not elected, so you're going by the substantial part test, you would want to include this volunteer time, assuming that they actually do what he asked them to do. You'd need to find out from these volunteer board members, how much are they doing on this. Again, doesn't need to be to the minute, and you need to keep track of it, extra carefully. But you certainly need to say on your 990 Schedule C that volunteer board members are lobbying on this, and give some sense, how many are there, how many board members are doing this, and so forth. So you need to track it in some way. And you also need to realize that Gene, I'm sure, is spending a little bit of time preparing that email, or maybe his assistant is helping him do that. So whatever time he is putting in, or others in the organization are putting in, to help their board members voluntarily help their board members do the lobbying, would also be considered lobbying on their part, so the same rules would apply.
Thank you, Anita, for such a terrific presentation. You've given us a wealth of useful information that's really hard to find all in one place. So thank you again.
Good. I hope did you test it to make sure the sound was okay?
It was great, and we are going to have a busy QA session as many questions have come in during your presentation. So are you ready for the first question?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Anita, again.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
We had a couple questions about getting copies of the slide presentation, so Kenny, do you want to answer that one while I'm reading the other? We do post the slide presentation as well as the report on the Power Tools webinar webpage, and that link would have been in your emails that you get as a registrant for this webinar, so you would have received it in your reminder email, your confirmation, and then you'll also get that link again in a follow-up email that is sent about an hour after the webinar ends. So everybody will get that. We have a question. You mentioned that an organization's volunteer activity may be viewed by the IRS as lobbying, and can you expand on this a little bit more? If an organization is spending time but not money with volunteers, how does that factor in?
Okay, I think the question was how does volunteer time, in other words, if the organization is spending time but not money, how does that factor in?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it depends on whether the organization is using the default substantial part test or the election to the Section 501H. If you're using the Section 501H, it doesn't factor in at all because you're not spending money. I'm assuming, however, you're probably not, and you're probably using the substantial part test. It figures into the total what the IRS calls facts and circumstances. So, for example, you have to include that time when you're thinking about is it a substantial part of your activity. So if you've got a great board that's spending, tons of time doing lobbying and doing grassroots lobbying and going down to your state legislature and all that kind of stuff, you have to include that in terms of the total time, just as you would time of your paid staff. There's no, it's not weighted any particular way. I can't say, well, it's 20% or 30%, or, but it is included as volunteer activities and is considered activity of your organization, even if no organization money is being spent on it. Doesn't mean it can't be done. Let me just be clear on that. Does not, and I would just want to say that over and over again so people don't get the wrong message here. Does not mean it can't be done. Just because it's lobbying doesn't mean you can't do it. Remember, you can do lobbying. You can do lobbying. Let me say that again. You can't do a lot of lobbying, but my guess is that for most of your organizations, this is still a pretty small piece of what you're doing overall. So my guess is that for most of you, you'll be able to engage in the amount of lobbying that you want to do for example, this Advocacy Month. You just need to track it. It depends on the size of your organization. It depends on what you're doing. But, for the most part, I mean, in my experience, unless, this is a really big part of what you're doing, or it's obviously a substantial part of what you're doing, it's a matter of being able to understand what lobbying is and tracking it. And it's a best faith thing. There are gray areas here. So you can't necessarily always say this is lobbying or this isn't lobbying. There are gray areas. You do the best you can. You make a best faith effort in terms of classifying something as lobbying or not.
Great, thanks. Another question, is lobbying reporting required if funds are not being used, the organization's funds are not being used to do so?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the beginning part of that question.
Is lobbying reporting required if organizations' funds are not being used for lobbying.
Okay, yes, that's similar to the prior question, and that assuming we're talking about the substantial part test as opposed to the quantitative 501H test, then yes, assuming that people are acting on behalf of the organization, okay, because they're saying they're speaking on president of blah 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 organization, I'm speaking on behalf of, they're using talking points in the organization and so forth, and they're speaking on behalf of the organization, then yes, that would be part of it. On the other hand, if you've got board members that are just in there as private citizens, not mentioning their connection to your organization, going up to the State House or calling their representatives and so forth, and there's no connection with your organization, then no, that wouldn't be counted as part of your organization's lobbying activity.
Megan, I have the page now, so if you want me to read, I can go ahead. And maybe just one or two more questions before you can continue, and then we'll hold some for the end.
Yep.
Okay, so we've addressed this before, but I just wanted to, we had a question saying that if a coalition receives federal funds and attends a work-related conference in DC, which includes time on the Hill for meeting their congressional leaders, would this be considered advocacy, and would a certain portion of the travel expenditures need to be reported to the IRS as lobbying costs?
Okay, so we're talking about a coalition that does receive federal grant funding. I'm assuming, let's assume for a second, I don't know if this is true, that they also receive other funding. It's not just all restricted grant funding, I'm hoping. So I don't know enough about what goes on at your DC meetings, your conference, to say whether the conference itself, the time you're spending at the conference, is lobbying or not.
Yeah,
we have a, yeah.
This is addressing our meeting. Our advocacy day, a lobbying event, is an entirely separate optional event that is kept perfectly separate from the main conference program.
Okay. All right. So then the piece of it then is that is not the sort of lobbying piece of the conference. Then,
correct.
Presumably, it furthers your charitable purposes, and presumably, if you're using federal grant funds to pay for, let's say, the fee that I assume there's some sort of conference fee and travel and hotel and so forth, then that could legitimately be used for the conference. However, if you attend this sort of optional lobbying part of the conference, and to the extent you go to the Hill and you're going to talk about specific legislation, which I assume is what you're doing. I've been to not your particular conference, but other conferences, and there's usually talking points, and usually the organizations say, try to get support on Senate Bill blankety blank, HR blankety blank. We want, $5 million for this, and it's usually pretty specific. Otherwise, it's not terribly helpful if you're not being that specific. Then there has to be an allocation. So there has to be an allocation for two purposes. One is for purposes of the IRS. Yes, you're going to need to figure out, okay, how much time and how much money, both, did you spend on the lobbying piece as opposed to the educational conference piece. And also for federal grant purposes, you need to do the same thing. So now, one option that some people do is they say, well, our organization doesn't really have any unrestricted funds, or can't spend it on this or whatever, so I'm just going to do it on my own personal time. You could do that. It's getting a little complicated, but you could see a situation where somebody is perhaps representing themselves as speaking on behalf of the organization on the Hill to staff, committee staff, and so forth, but maybe they're doing it on their own time. In other words, they're not clocking it as work time. Maybe they're taking vacation time to do it. So I've seen that happen as well. So for IRS purposes, since you're speaking on behalf of the organization, it would be considered lobbying. It would have to be reported on the 990 and considered part of the total lobbying activities of your organization. But perhaps for your federal grant purposes, you're saying, I'm doing this on my own time. I'm going to put it on my time card as vacation. I'm not being, well, you may be paid for vacation, but it's still not considered paid time. So you could sort of do it. There are different ways of doing it. But yes, I think basically you probably would want to allocate some portion of your time and expenses to lobbying in that scenario, depending on whether you actually went to the Hill and whether you attended that optional lobbying portion of the conference.
Thank you, Anita. So we can continue now. And do you see my screen?
I do.
Okay.
I don't see the, but no, now I don't see it actually. This one's black.
Oh.
There we go. Okay, now I see. I don't know this. Now it's on there. So let's go on to the examples then. And I don't know if we'll get through them all because we've only got 10 minutes, but we'll try to get through some of them. And I've used sort of different fact scenarios. I wish I was there so I could actually talk to you and get some feedback. Although feel free if anybody wants to comment, we can open the mics, I think, to do that. Or if anyone from the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee wants to comment, that's fine as well. It makes it a little bit hard when there's no one on the other end, but we'll do what we can with it. Hopefully you've maybe discussed this among yourselves if you're listening with other people. So we have Joanne, an employee of a 501c3 organization, and she goes on a tour with her local state reps of some local hospitals and health centers providing breastfeeding support for new mothers. No discussion of any proposed legislation or government funding of any breastfeeding programs, just kind of showing the state reps what these programs do and what the impact has been, and particular types of providers that provide services or support or education for breastfeeding in the local community. So is that going to be considered lobbying or not? Education, advocacy, any red flags here, anything that you need to be concerned about? I think the answer is that that's not lobbying. That's really education. There's been no discussion in there about any proposed legislation or government funding or anything like that. It's really just showing your elected representatives what your program's all about, what the issues are, and educating them on these issues. Now, ideally, you would do this type of thing not actually during your advocacy month, but throughout the year, because the closer it is in time tied to lobbying efforts, then the more likely it is it's going to have to be considered lobbying. Whereas if you do it in February, where it's not tied to a particular advocacy campaign, it's just, let's say someone was just elected in November and you want to show them what your program's all about or what's being done in your community, then that would be more likely to be considered education and not lobbying. Okay, number 2, the State Breastfeeding Coalition, which is a C3 that receives no government funding, posts on its website a request to its readers to contact their representatives in Congress to urge them to vote in favor of the Breastfeeding Promotion Act. I understand that actually was an act. I don't know if it's still pending now, but was filed a couple of years ago in Congress. And what issues there? Is that lobbying? Is it not lobbying? What do you need to do about it, if anything? Well, I think that would be considered lobbying. That's really grassroots lobbying. It's asking people who read the website to contact their representatives and vote in favor of this bill. So that would be your classic grassroots lobbying. That would be something that should be reported on the 990 and should be tracked. How do you track it? Well, you have to sort of have a rough estimate. What are the costs of the website? And it's an allocation issue. It's not all that specific, but it's an allocation issue. Think about all your IT costs, whether it's personnel, whether it's whoever wrote the website content, your hosting fees. What are your fees connected with that posting? So that would be considered lobbying. And there's no government funding, so you don't need to think about that there. Then just below that, same as above, but the request was sent by email only to the members. Let's go back, thank you, to the members of the coalition. Well, that's a little bit different because when it's members, there's somewhat different rules, assuming that this C3 elected to be subject to the quantitative test rather than the substantial part test. So if the organization elected to be subject to the substantial part test, then since they sent it only to members as opposed to posting it on the website, but they still actually did ask for them to contact representatives, that would be considered lobbying, but only the direct lobbying, not grassroots lobbying. Why does that matter? Well, remember there's an additional cap on grassroots lobbying. So it's better to be considered direct lobbying than grassroots lobbying because there's a stricter limitation on grassroots lobbying. Again, this only applies if you have elected to be subject to the 501H. And then the second bullet there below, same as number 2, but the request is only sent to the members and doesn't ask members to contact. So there's no call to action. In that case, that wouldn't even be considered lobbying. So there's slightly different rules for members than for non-members. Okay, next example. And we have Sarah, an employee of the C3 that's a member of the State Breastfeeding Coalition and doesn't receive government grant funds, meets with her congresswoman in D.C. to talk about the need for increased funding for WIC peer counseling. So is that considered lobbying? Well, yes, I think it is. Increased funding, that's appropriations, that's one of Congress's jobs. They usually don't get it done on time, but eventually there's some sort of continuing resolution, and they do appropriate funding for the most part, although I guess there's some problem with the highways these days. Anyways, so that would be considered lobbying. She's meeting with her congresswoman. She's asking for more money. That would involve an appropriation for the WIC program. Now we have Jean, who's an employee of another C3 that's also a member of the statewide Breastfeeding Coalition, but does receive federal grant funding, also attends the meeting. Well, okay, we've got that federal grant funding issue again. So what does that mean? Well, it's certainly lobbying, just the way it is for Sarah and her organization. But he's got to also consider the federal grant funding aspect of it. And so most likely, he is not going to be able to charge his time to the federal grant for that meeting and for the preparation in connection with that meeting. So what does that mean? Well, either hopefully his organization has some unrestricted funds, and so they will allocate a portion of his salary and compensation and so forth to unrestricted funds and pay for it with unrestricted funds. Or perhaps he'll decide, well, you know what, we don't really have any unrestricted funds. I don't want to use it for that purpose. So I will do it on my own time. Two things about that. One is that, well, that's fine if Jean is the executive director or is some other non-exempt employee. In other words, typically we think of as a salaried employee. But if they are paid, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If he is an exempt employee, so in other words, not paid on an hourly basis, but paid on a salary, and doesn't necessarily, isn't paid for every hour of his time, is just paid to do the job, that's an exempt employee. So if that's the case, then that's all right. Don't have to worry about the particular issue of is he being paid for work that he is required to do. If, on the other hand, Jean is a non-exempt employee and is paid on an hourly basis, well, then you get into Fair Labor Standards Act stuff, which says that the person has to be paid for every hour they work. So they can't really just volunteer to take vacation time and not be paid for that time. So you just have to be concerned about that issue. Typically, the people that would be doing the lobbying that would go into these meetings are probably exempt employees, so not too much of an issue on that. Okay, and then you also have Judy. So prior to the meeting, Judy, who works for Jean, prepares a report summarizing the health and economic benefits of breastfeeding for Jean and Sarah to use at the meeting. Then you get into the issue of, okay, what about preparation? She's not actually going to the meeting. She's preparing a report that will be used by her boss as well as another person from another organization. Well, that's going to be considered part of the preparation time. So that would also be counted as part of the lobbying activities. And given that the C3 that Jean and Judy work for get federal funds, need to make sure that that's not paid for out of federal grant funds. Let me just make one other point for those of you who do receive federal grant funds. I know that a lot of times organizations will say, okay, this person is 100% paid for with this grant. If that person, I always recommend if that person does any sort of lobbying, or you're thinking about that person doing any sort of lobbying or other unallowable activities such as fundraising, for example, don't put them on 100% of the grant. Put them on 98% of the grant in the budget, so that they have a little bit of time that they can spend on things like lobbying and fundraising that can't be charged to federal grants. The other thing to think about is, don't forget about the lobbying disclosure laws. So we're talking about federal lobbying here. How much lobbying are they doing? Is the organization exempt because it doesn't spend more than $12,500 in any 3-month period? Or are these people exempt because they don't spend more than 20% of their time? Probably. Most likely you're not going to have to report and register under the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act. But again, you need to assess how much lobbying you're doing, and does it exceed any of these thresholds for lobbying disclosure or for the small amount of lobbying that can be done by C3s. Okay, next. And this is the last example here. Jean has asked his volunteer board members to email their congressional representatives urging them to vote for a bill in the state legislature that would require paid breastfeeding breaks. So this actually was probably answered by the questions we had earlier. Volunteer board members. Now, if this is an organization that has elected the 501H quantitative test, then don't need to even think about this in terms of reporting for the 990, or you don't need to worry about it for federal grant purposes either, at least with respect to the time that they spend, the volunteer board members spend. However, even then, if staff members are using their paid time to prepare the board members, to train them, to do fact sheets, that sort of thing, then you do have to think about what is the funding source and make sure that federal grant funds are not being used for that purpose, and that any time that paid staff is spending on this would be counted as lobbying, even for the 501H organization. However, if you are not electing as a 501H and you're just doing the substantial part test, which is probably most of you, then you would need to include this volunteer board time as part of your calculation of, is it a substantial part of your activities? So I think that would be it. If you have any questions, you have my contact information on the first slide. And certainly if you're in the Massachusetts area and you need any assistance with other nonprofit legal issues, please feel free to contact me. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Anita. And this is one of the most comprehensive advocacy and lobbying trainings that I've had. And I know that our audience will be going back to it many, many times to look at and view it and to look at different parts of it. So we do not have, we've run out of time for questions, but we haven't had any more come in since the last question Q&A session. So if there are any that haven't been answered, we'll make sure to follow that up with you. And thank you for offering to answer those offline and with any specific questions that they have. And I just wanted to tell our audience that we do have Power Tool webinars coming up in September and November. We have Grant Seeking Basics in September and Strategic Communications in November. So until next time, thank you very much, and a very big thanks to Anita Lischbrow for this fabulous presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.